There's a sealed envelope sitting on a mahogany desk inside Buckingham Palace that was never supposed to be opened during a moment of peace. It was designed as a weapon for a time of crisis, written in the careful, deliberate hand of a woman who spent 70 years anticipating every threat her family would ever face. Queen Elizabeth II had been gone for over 3 years when that envelope finally reached her eldest son. And what was written inside didn't just rearrange the furniture of the British monarchy, it detonated a bomb directly beneath the throne. This is the story of a secret royal decree, a queen consort pushed to the edge, and a princess who walked through fire and came out the other side holding the future of the crown in her hands. And it starts on an afternoon that King Charles III will never be able to forget. The Forgotten Envelope. April 2026. Buckingham Palace carried its usual gravity, centuries of history pressing down on every corridor, every portrait, every whispered conversation between staff members who understood that silence was part of the job description. But something was different that afternoon. There was an energy in the building that had nothing to do with ceremony or tradition. It felt like the hours before a storm breaks, when the air gets heavy and the birds go quiet. King Charles III sat in his private study, a room that smelled permanently of oak, candle wax, and the particular kind of stillness that only very old buildings hold. He had been preparing a comprehensive modernization plan for the royal family, something he'd been working toward for months. The monarchy needed to evolve or risk becoming irrelevant in a world that moved faster every single day. Charles held the envelope for a long time before opening it. He ran his thumb across the wax seal, feeling the impression his mother's signet ring had left in it. Then he broke it open. He summoned his most trusted advisors. They gathered around him, seasoned faces that had served through 2 reigns, people who thought they had seen everything the palace could produce. Charles began reading the decree aloud, and within 30 seconds, every single one of them understood that nothing inside these walls would ever be the same again. The decree that rewrote the rules. This was not a sentimental letter. It wasn't a grandmother's warm wishes for the future. It was a strategic document, precise and unflinching, written by a monarch who had spent 7 decades learning exactly how power works and exactly how it falls apart. Queen Elizabeth II had officially appointed Princess Catherine, the Princess of Wales, as supreme patron of the monarchy's modernization process. The title alone would have been significant, but it was the scope of authority attached to it that made the advisors in that room forget to breathe. Kate was granted direct control over the management of royal charitable funds. She was given veto power over the royal family's media campaigns. She received a formal seat on the council managing the monarchy's assets, a position traditionally reserved exclusively for the sovereign or the direct heir to the throne. In plain terms, the late queen had looked across her entire family, past her children, past decades of tradition and protocol, and placed the future of the Windsor dynasty in the hands of her grandson's wife. Not as a symbolic gesture, as a binding directive. The reasoning was clear to anyone who had watched Kate over the previous 15 years. She had proven herself repeatedly, most powerfully, during the brutal media storms of 2024, when her health battle became public and she handled the exposure with a composure that reminded veteran palace observers of Elizabeth herself. She combined warmth with steel, accessibility with dignity, modernity with respect for tradition. The late queen had seen. What he didn't know was that someone else had already heard every single word. The listener in the corridor. The door to the antechamber had been slightly ajar, not enough to see through, more than enough to hear through. Queen Camilla stood motionless on the other side, her breathing carefully controlled, her face completely still. She had arrived intending to check on the schedule for the afternoon's engagements. Instead, she had walked straight into the most devastating conversation of her life. Every phrase landed like a separate blow. Supreme authority, pivotal role, future of the monarchy. And every single one of them attached to Kate's name. Not hers, never hers. Camilla had spent decades fighting for her place. The public hostility after Diana's death. The years of being treated as the other woman by a nation that refused to forgive. The slow, painful rehabilitation of her image, one carefully managed appearance at a time, one charity visit at a time, one polite smile at a time. She had endured all of it because she believed that eventually the sacrifice would be recognized. That when she finally stood beside Charles as his queen, the position would carry real weight. And now, in the space of a single afternoon, a dead woman's handwriting on old parchment had reduced that position to decoration. The new power structure was unmistakable. Charles, William, and Kate would form the operational core of the monarchy going forward. Camilla's role would be ceremonial at best, a title without teeth, a crown without a kingdom. She didn't enter the room. She didn't interrupt. She didn't allow a single person to see what was happening behind her eyes. She turned and walked down the corridor alone, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a steady, measured rhythm that sounded nothing like the chaos detonating inside her chest. She paused at a large window overlooking the courtyard where the guards were changing shift. Rain was beginning to streak across the glass. She watched the precise, mechanical movements of the soldiers below and felt something harden inside her with the same cold precision. She would not become a footnote. She would not be quietly shelved while Kate was elevated to a position that Camilla had spent her entire adult life earning the right to occupy. If the rules had been written to honor someone else and sideline her, then the rules would have to be rewritten, or the people enforcing them would have to be removed. The decision was made before she turned away from the window. No words were spoken aloud. None needed to be. Face to face. The following morning, Camilla moved through the palace corridors with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. Charles was occupied with private audiences. The guards had stepped away briefly to prepare for the king's next engagement. The study door was unlocked. She slipped inside and found the decree sitting on the mahogany desk, uncovered, as if daring someone to challenge it. She picked it up and began reading, line by line, absorbing every devastating detail she hadn't been able to see through that crack in the door. The more she read, the worse it got. Kate hadn't just been given a title, she'd been given the machinery of the monarchy itself. Control over funds, veto power over public image, a seat at the table where the real decisions were made. The late Queen's handwriting was firm and confident across every line, the penmanship of someone who had never once doubted this choice. In the eyes of Queen Elizabeth II, Camilla was the king's companion. Kate was the future. Heavy footsteps in the corridor. Charles appeared in the doorway. His face shifted from surprise to something much harder when he saw what Camilla was holding. No greeting, no pleasantries. The atmosphere in the room compressed into something nearly suffocating. Camilla raised the decree like evidence of a crime committed against her. Her eyes burned with accusation, demanding an explanation for why everything she had sacrificed had been casually overwritten by a woman who had been buried for 3 years. She didn't need to raise her voice. The fury was loud enough in her silence. Charles crossed his arms, his expression calcified into something she had rarely seen directed at her. The gentleness that usually lived in his face when he looked at his wife was completely gone, replaced by the immovable resolve of a king defending a legacy far larger than any marriage. He took the decree from her hands slowly, deliberately, and placed it back on the desk with a reverence that made his position unmistakably clear. He shook his head once. A single, final refusal. This document was not a negotiation. It was not a suggestion. It was a sacred oath he had made to his mother, and no personal grievance, no matter how deeply felt, would cause him to break it. Camilla stepped back. The disappointment that carved itself into her face was not the soft kind. It was the kind that comes when someone realizes the person they trusted most has chosen something else over them, permanently and without appeal. She turned toward the door. At the threshold, she paused. Her shoulders trembled once, barely visible, from the force of everything she was holding back. She looked over her shoulder at Charles one final time, and there was nothing soft left in her expression. No plea, no sadness, only a cold, crystalline determination that made the temperature in the room drop. She disappeared into the corridor. Her hands were clenched so tight, her fingertips had gone white. If I cannot change the rules, I will change the players. The thought moved through her like electricity. Somewhere behind her, Charles stood alone in the study, staring at the decree, not yet understanding that the woman walking away from him had just declared a war he wasn't prepared to fight. The flood. It started before sunrise, before the first light touched London's skyline, before the palace staff had finished their morning routines, before anyone inside those walls had time to prepare for what was coming. Every major tabloid, every online news outlet, every social media platform that mattered, all of them simultaneously erupted with the same story, told from slightly different angles but carrying the same poisonous core. Princess Catherine was accused of exploiting the late Queen's trust for personal power. Leaked documents suggested she had been quietly maneuvering behind the scenes for years, positioning herself to seize control of the monarchy's financial assets. Anonymous palace sources painted her as calculating, ambitious, and dangerously unaccountable. Several outlets went further, dragging Charles himself into the narrative, suggesting the king was manipulating succession protocols to consolidate power around Kate at the expense of every other family member. The coordination was flawless, the timing was surgical, and the speed at which it consumed public attention was unlike anything the palace communications team had ever faced. Kate sat motionless in her bedroom that morning, staring at a screen filled with headlines that systematically dismantled everything she had spent 15 years building. Each article took a small, true detail about her charitable work and twisted it into evidence of a grand scheme. Her steady hands, the ones that had waved to millions of people with warmth and grace, clenched together until her knuckles turned white. The feeling that spread through her wasn't fear. It was something closer to disgust. The realization that someone who understood exactly how the palace worked from the inside had weaponized that knowledge against her with precision that no outside attacker could have achieved. In his study, Charles stood over the newspapers arranged on his desk and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew media tactics. He had survived decades of them. But this was different. The timing, landing days after the decree had been privately revealed, was too perfect. The insider details were too accurate. The angles of attack were too carefully calibrated. This wasn't a leak. This was a campaign, and it was coming from inside the building. The hunt in the dark. Charles made a decision that evening that he had hoped he would never have to make. He bypassed official palace security entirely and activated a network of independent investigators, people who answered only to the crown and operated completely outside the media's reach. The investigation moved fast. Digital forensics teams traced the anonymous emails that had been sent to newsrooms and found a web of offshore accounts used to funnel significant payments to freelance journalists and social media coordinators. The unauthorized access to the palace's internal archives, the source of the leaked documents, was tracked to IP addresses originating from a specific, highly restricted area within the palace itself, an area accessible to only a handful of the most senior insiders. Each new piece of evidence tightened the circle. The breakthrough came in a windowless room deep in the palace basement. A veteran editor, already facing serious legal exposure for blackmail and breach of state secrets, broke under the weight of the evidence presented to him. His composure collapsed in stages, first the excuses, then the deflections, then the silence, and finally the shaking hands reaching for a hard drive he'd been keeping as insurance. The drive contained recorded phone calls, commanding text messages, meeting schedules, and handwritten notes in a script that Charles had seen every day for decades. He received the complete investigation file on a late afternoon as sunset turned London's sky a deep, bleeding red. He opened it alone. He read every page. And when he reached the name that appeared most frequently throughout the evidence, he set the file down and sat completely still for a very long time. Camilla. Not indirect involvement, not circumstantial connections, direct communication between her private secretary and the architects of the smear campaign. Meeting schedules in her own handwriting. Financial authorization traced to accounts she controlled. The proof wasn't ambiguous. It was devastating. Charles leaned back in his chair and let the room darken around him. The portrait of Queen Elizabeth II hung on the wall directly across from him, her expression as steady and unreadable as it had always been, as if she had known this moment would come and had already made peace with it. The betrayal hadn't arrived from a distant enemy or a foreign adversary or a tabloid editor with a grudge. It had come from the woman who slept beside him, the woman he had risked his reputation, his family's approval, and his mother's patience to stand beside, the woman he had crowned as his queen. He looked up at his mother's portrait and spoke quietly into the empty room. Words meant for no one and everyone at the same time. An acknowledgement that the decision he was about to make would save one thing and destroy another, and that both of them mattered to him more than he could express. The reckoning at St. James's. The press conference at St. James Palace was announced with minimal advance notice, which guaranteed maximum attendance. Every major outlet sent their senior correspondents. The room was packed so tightly that the air itself felt pressurized. London's sky hung heavy with lead-colored clouds, as if the weather had decided to match the mood. Charles stood before a mirror in the dressing room beforehand, adjusting his suit with movements so slow and deliberate they looked almost ceremonial. Each small gesture seemed to cost him something. When he stepped out before the cameras, followed by Princess Kate wearing royal blue with an expression of absolute composure, the room collectively held its breath. The silence was so complete, you could hear the mechanical clicking of camera shutters from the back row. Charles didn't open with an explanation. He didn't address the rumors. He didn't defend. Instead, he instructed the royal secretary to read the full text of Queen Elizabeth II's secret decree aloud, word by word, to the assembled press and the millions watching live. Every sentence from the late Queen landed in that room like a bell being struck. Her reasoning was meticulous. Her trust in Kate was total. Her vision for the monarchy's future was so clearly articulated that it made the smear campaign of the previous weeks look exactly like what it was: desperate, manufactured, and completely disconnected from reality. When the passage about the supreme patron role was read aloud, the weeks of carefully constructed doubt evaporated instantly. The accusation that Kate had been grabbing power collapsed under the simple, undeniable truth that the power had been given to her, deliberately and explicitly, by the most respected monarch in modern British history. Kate stood beside the king without saying a single word. She didn't need to. Her presence was the statement. The woman the tabloids had spent weeks painting as a schemer stood there radiating exactly the kind of quiet, unshakable dignity that had made Elizabeth choose her in the first place. Then came the part that wasn't about Kate at all. Charles, his voice perfectly steady, announced a new decree restructuring internal palace authority. The Queen Consort's office would be severely restricted in its administrative functions. Its ability to intervene in the royal family's broader affairs would be formally curtailed. The announcement was delivered in purely procedural language, clean and bureaucratic, with no names attached to accusations and no evidence presented to the public. He never said Camilla's name in connection with the campaign. He never revealed what the investigation had found. He gave her the one thing she probably didn't deserve, but desperately needed: the dignity of silence. It was his final act of mercy toward the woman he had loved. And it was simultaneously the most devastating punishment he could have chosen, because it meant she would have to live with the knowledge of what she had done, watching Kate thrive in the role she had tried to destroy, without ever being given the public confrontation that might have allowed her to justify herself. In a private room at Buckingham Palace, Camilla watched the entire broadcast on a screen. She saw Kate standing in the light, radiant and vindicated. She saw Charles, steady as granite, fulfilling his mother's wishes without a backward glance. And she saw herself slowly, irreversibly dissolving into the margins of a story that was no longer hers to influence. What remains? In the months that followed, something genuinely changed inside Buckingham Palace. Not just the organizational charts or the reporting lines, but the atmosphere itself. The air felt different. The corridors carried a different kind of energy. Kate stepped into her new role with the focus of someone who understood exactly what had been entrusted to her and exactly what it had cost. Her office overlooked St. James's Park, and she used it the way a general uses a command center, reviewing healthcare and education reform projects with a level of personal involvement that surprised even the most demanding advisors. She wasn't delegating from a distance. She was in the details, her hands on the plans, asking the questions that mattered. When she appeared in public now, there was something different in her eyes. The bitterness from the weeks of slander was completely gone. In its place was a confidence that looked like it had been forged under enormous pressure and had come out harder and clearer on the other side, the way diamonds actually form. Camilla still attended ceremonial events. She still smiled for the cameras, but the substance behind the smile had been quietly removed. Major decisions no longer crossed her desk. Her counsel no longer carried the weight it once had. She existed in a state of elegant isolation, present but powerless, visible but voiceless. An invisible punishment administered by a husband who had chosen the crown over the marriage and who would carry the weight of that choice for the rest of his life. Charles himself watched these changes unfold with a serenity that had taken him a very long time to find. At a major event at Westminster Abbey, he stood at the edge of the room and watched Kate receive a standing ovation from the assembled crowd. He gave a small nod and a quiet smile that nobody else noticed. In her, he saw exactly what his mother had seen: the stability, the adaptability, the dedication that had allowed Elizabeth to reign for 70 years. The crack in his heart from Camilla's betrayal might never fully close, but it had been covered over by something that mattered more: the certainty that the institution was safe. On a late afternoon, bathed in golden light, Kate stood on the palace balcony looking out at thousands of people waving flags and flowers below her. She wasn't just seeing a crowd, she was seeing the future of something that had survived for over 1,000 years, finding its next breath. Behind her, Charles had already stepped back into the shadows of the room, yielding the spotlight entirely, knowing he had fulfilled the last promise he had ever made to his mother. The story of the House of Windsor would continue. It had been tested by jealousy and betrayal, and the kind of quiet cruelty that only happens between people who share the same roof. But it had come through the other side intact, reshaped, and ready for whatever came next. Whether that survival was worth the price that was paid for it is a question that only the people inside those walls can truly answer. And based on everything that happened, they may never fully agree. Now let me ask you this. Was Charles right to protect Camilla's name from the public, to punish her in silence rather than expose her fully? Was that mercy, or was it a cowardly compromise that denied Kate the full vindication she deserved? Drop your answer in the comments. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and tap the next video on your screen right now. Trust me, you're going to want to see what's in that one.